Well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. I want to talk to you this morning about granny flats. Some time ago, a few years ago, the provincial government passed sweeping legislation that overrode every official plan in the province. What they basically said was that anybody in a single-family home, regardless of zoning, were entitled to put a secondary dwelling within their property, within their house. Now, the reason they did that was twofold. First of all, they recognized that we have a housing shortage, and they felt that this would provide additional housing accommodation for people in need couldn't find it. The other reason was they recognized that there were a lot of people, especially seniors, who were house rich and cash poor. They were living in their houses, and yet they were having a hard time paying the taxes and putting food on the table. And they felt this would solve both those problems. Now, they did allow the municipalities to put in bylaws that could massage this responsibility. Some municipalities allow ancillary dwellings outside of the house. In other words, like a garage or a separate building in the backyard. Some do not. Some have specific requirements as far as square footage. St. Catharines is one such municipality. So they have other restrictions, let's say, that they can impose. But St. Catharines says, and I think a lot of municipalities are this way, they say we are not proactive, we're reactive. In other words, we don't go looking for trouble, but we will react upon it if we get a complaint. So that's the situation we've got now, where these in-law apartments, granny flats if you like, are legal throughout the city, throughout the area, throughout Niagara. Having said that, and this is what I want to zero in on today, is it doesn't mean they've created duplexes. And it's important that we understand. You say, well, Wayne, if you got two families living in the same dwelling, isn't that a duplex? Not necessarily. And here's what you as realtors got to be very, very careful about. We see this a lot in semi-detached. A lot of semi-detached, for some reason or other, have taken the basement and created an apartment that they can rent out. So the person who lives in the home has an apartment and has additional income coming in from the apartment, and then they decide to sell the unit. But the person who buys it isn't somebody moving into the main floor and enjoying secondary income. The person who buys it is an investor. And because the investor's not living in the property, it's functioning as a duplex. And that's not really allowed under the legislation. See, the legislation allows me to do this in my house, providing I'm living in the house. If I'm not living in the house, I'm an investor, and I've got one party renting the one floor, one party renting the other floor, and if a neighbor complains, the city will shut it down. Now, why is that a concern? Well, it's a concern because if the buyer is an investor and he's counting on that cash flow, he gets a complaint, he's out of business. And he's much more vulnerable. Throughout the city, we've got all kinds of legal duplexes that are illegal triplexes. But they're in multifamily streets. Nobody's going to complain because there's three families living in the house rather than two families living in the house. It's a multifamily situation. But if you're in a single residential zoning and you've got a secondary apartment in there, and all of a sudden you've got two separate people and you start getting problems, which you may or may not get, too many cars in the driveway, some noise, some feud between them, any kind of a problem at all. A neighbor realizes it's a single family home. They don't want to put up with this. They call the city. The city's got no choice. They're going to shut it down. So it's very, very important if you are a realtor in this situation and you are listing this kind of property, you need to have this discussion with the seller. And ultimately, if you're representing the buyer, you need to have this discussion with the buyer. I've seen all kinds of them that have been bought by investors, and as long as the investor knows, and if I'm not representing the buyer, if I'm representing the seller, it's still incumbent on me to make sure that the buyer knows what he's getting. So it's a granny flat, it's not a duplex. It's halfway in between. It's a real benefit to the owner of the property, and it could be a benefit to the new owner of the property who's not moving in, but maybe not. Be careful. Thanks very much for your time. I'll talk to you again next week.